You know what really grinds my gears? Student loan debt. More specifically, Canadian student loan debt. I'm sure that you've all heard of the American side of the story, but today I'm going to be diving into the Canadian side of the story and teaching you how to pay off your student loans if you have them. $28 billion. That's how much money Canadians owe to the federal government in student loans. And that number, well, actually the number's gone down in the past few years because of the tuition freezes. I never thought I'd be saying this, but thanks, Dougie. That felt so weird. But that being said, according to the National Graduate Survey taken in 2018, your average college student graduated with $15,300 of student loan debt, and your average university student, bachelor's and master's, graduated with about $28,000 of student loan debt. $28,000, that's an entire car. So when did this all begin? Well, after the Second World War, when people were coming back, they started to realize that they needed jobs, and the way to get jobs was to get an education. So they would go to university, they would go to college, and they would become more educated. And the government would fully support this initiative by paying for a lot of school through taxes and other means. But since the 1980s, the government's cut of funding to universities has been steadily decreasing to now dropping more than 50% from the amount that it was in the 1980s. So in order to fight this, universities had to respond by increasing their tuition fees, passing on the burden of education to students. Now, I think where the problem starts is that universities, in some sense, are not regulated to how much they can charge in tuition. In some cases, there are caps to the maximum amount they can increase it every year, but almost without fail for the past 20 years, every single year has been increasing by the maximum amount. And I'm not sure that that is completely necessary on the university's end. But then you flip over to the other side and you have to look at both ends of the table. What are we doing wrong and what are they doing wrong, and what can both of us be doing better? According to RBC's Gerald Walsh, universities have been steadily rising their prices because people will pay. And to that point, getting a university degree usually will land you a 63% higher salary than the person without a university degree. And another driving factor is that children of people with university degrees are more likely to themselves be pushed to getting a university degree. And with the university degree usually comes more steady jobs and less likely to collapse in times of economic distress. So despite the fact that universities seem to keep rising their tuition, I seem to be making a pretty good case for why you should still be going to university and maybe taking on some student loan debt. But is university actually a good investment? Well, let's find out. Based on the stat I showed you earlier, the average bachelor's degree graduate will graduate with $28,000 of student loan debt. And according to OSAP, it takes an average of 114 months, which equals 9.5 years, to pay off all of your student loans. And here's where we run into another problem. You can get student loans from so many different sources and rack on pretty much as much student loan debt as you could ever want, and it doesn't seem to bother anyone. I'm sure most of you watching have heard of OSAP, the Ontario Student Assistance Program, or another provincial student loans program. So what happens is you apply to the government, and based on things like your parents' income, they will decide how much of a loan to give you, or if to give you a loan at all. So you apply to this loan, and then OSAP proceeds to pay your tuition for you. And I think that this is the extent of the research that most people have done on their loans. They apply to OSAP, OSAP pays the tuition for them, and they go to school, no problemo. Well, that's not exactly how it works. Once you graduate, you are on the hook for every dollar that the government lent to you that wasn't your own money. And that's what happens when you use other people's money, you owe it back to them, usually with interest. Now, I'm not sure about other provinces, but at least in Ontario here, you have a 6-month grace period, so you can pretend like everything is fine for 6 months after you graduate, and then you get hit with the stark reality. So now that we got the basics cleared out of the way, let's get into something else that really kind of bothers me and makes these even more confusing than they should be. Once you graduate and you have realized that you have to pay this OSAP money back at some point in your future, 10 years, let's say, after you graduate, Now, what do you do when you pay it off? Well, your first instinct would be to go to the OSAP website where you applied for the student loan. But guess what? That's not how you pay it off. You have to go to this thing called the National Canadian Student Loan Service Center, NLSCSC, I don't know, put it over here. So you have to go to their website, and that is where you would pay off your student loan. Most people don't know that either when they're going into it, so the loan kind of just magically goes away, and then they forget about it, and it's like, oh, OSAP doesn't want any money back from me, and then they find out 6 months after when the creditors come calling and say, hey, you missed 6 payments of your student loan. Now, I understand the good intention of the government in doing this, and what they wanted to do was have every province in one central location to be able to pay off their student loans, because before 2017, you would get a federal government student loan and a provincial government student loan in Ontario. I think some provinces still give federal loans, but for the most part, I think they're phasing it out and passing all of the costs to the province. So it's up to the provinces to decide whether or not they're going to help fund people's education. Now, what is the interest rate on your student loan? Well, it depends how the economy is doing. When you're paying off your OSAP student loan, the interest that you will owe will be the prime rate plus 1% interest. And for those of you who don't know very much about monetary policy, I'm going to put a link in the video description about Canadian monetary policy, and you can learn what the prime rate is. But all you have to really know right now is that it's at 2.45%. So the interest on your loan starting now and likely for the next 2 years, from what I've been reading, it's going to be steady. You will be paying 3.45% on your student loans. So let's just assume that you are extremely average. You have $28,000 of student loan debt, you're going to be paying 3.45% in interest, and you plan on taking 114 months to pay off your student loans. How will this affect your lifestyle and your income? In other words, is it worth going to school and taking out loans in the first place? So to start off this conversation, we have to go and look up what the average starting salary is for a new graduate. And according to this article that I found online and a few other sources that I've been compiling, I'm estimating that an average starting salary for a university graduate is $55,000 per year. Depending on your degree, this number might be significantly higher or significantly lower. And depending on whether you're at the top of your class and you have the connections, all of those things. But let's assume for the sake of this video that you are making $55,000 when you graduate. And now let's further assume that you are making an additional $5,000 per year for the next 10 years. So your salary growth rate is $5,000 per year for the next 10 years. How does a student loan affect you? So at an income of $55,000, your after-tax take-home money will be about $3,500 per month. Now, if we go to the OSAP website and we put in the amount of our student loan, it will tell us that it's going to cost us about $300 per month to pay it off. Now, let's try to hypothesize your spending in the wonderful city of Toronto, because that's where every new grad would ever want to live. That's where I want to live when I graduate. So let's assume that you are living in the wonderful city of Toronto and you have this student loan. So the average one-bedroom apartment in the city of Toronto is $2,300 per month. I swear that's right. I've looked up many articles and I swear to you that that is right. Which is completely insane, which probably means you're not going to be living in Toronto unless you rent with someone else or you're living with your parents. Do something else, because 2/3 of your income going towards your rent is absolutely insane. Just to make things a little bit better, I'm going to run you through 2 scenarios. One where you take on a perfect one-bedroom, $2,300 a month apartment in downtown Toronto, and the other where you decide to be a bit smarter, you go live with your parents, you split the rent with a roommate, or you find some other way to reduce that rent cost. You get really lucky, you get a good deal, whatever. But we're going to assume that you pay very little expenses in the second option. So let's break down the expenses. $2,300 a month in rent. $500 a month in food. Let's assume that you didn't get a car because your apartment costs too much money. and another $500 on things like clothes, internet, Wi-Fi, other expenses, and just throw another $500 on top because people like to go out, they want to go to restaurants, they want to go clubbing, whatever. So this amount will leave you at about $3,600 per month. And if you remember, your income was $3,500 a month. So you're sitting at negative $100. Great start. And on top of that, lest we forget, you have a $300 a month student loan to be paying off. Okay, now let's move to scenario 2. Scenario 1 didn't work out very well for us. As you can see, we're negative $400, and you're probably just going to end up servicing that debt with more debt at an even higher interest rate, which is not good. So let's assume in scenario 2 that you're living with your parents, or you have a roommate and you've got your rent costs down to $750 a month. And since you're living with your parents or a roommate, you can split food expense $350 a month. Your Wi-Fi and internet expense $100 a month. Random other stuff expense $500 a month. After that, you have to pay a student loan $300 a month. That total comes to $2,000 a month of expenses and leaves you with $1,500 a month. Now, if you're like most people, the first thought is going to be like, wow, I have this much more money to spend every month. I want you to change your thinking and either use that to pay off your student loan or use that to invest your money in your tax-free savings account or your RRSP or investing it in the stock market in an index fund. A good rule of thumb is unless your interest expense is more than 5% on a loan, you're probably better off finding a different investment that will pay you more interest than it's costing you to service the loan. So, for example, you're paying 3.45% on the student loan. It doesn't make sense in most cases to use your extra money to put towards the student loan when you could put it in the stock market and get an average of an 8% return over a long period of time. Now, some other math I want to do for you is to figure out exactly how much, if you take 10 years to pay off your student loan, how much you'll be paying in interest and in principal. So your principal payments work out to be about $2,800, you wish. $28,000 goes towards your principal, and that leaves you with $6,000 of interest according to my online calculator. So $300 a month doesn't seem like too much, you know, it's whatever. Like, I can deal with $300 a month. It's not the end of the world. But if you were to invest this $300 a month every month for 45 years and you compounded it in the stock market, you would have more than $1 million in an investment portfolio. So there is a expense to this university, but of course you're only paying the $300 for 10 years, so you still have 35 years to get started. But as you can see, what happens is if you start 10 years later investing, you only make $500,000. You literally cut the amount of investment money that you have by half just because you decided to start 10 years later. Another article that I found kind of interesting and relevant is that the average expenses per year for a student living away from home at university is $20,000 versus the average expenses for a student living at home is just $9,000. But as I'm sure many of my engineering friends can relate, our tuition fees kind of just knock it out of the park and completely leave us in the dust. So let's not forget that in some cases you're paying more, some cases you're paying less. Like for myself in the past year, I did the math, it cost me about $30,000 living away from home. And I'm lucky, extremely lucky, that I have parents who are willing to pay for most of it for me. Unlike some people out there, I don't need to take student loans in order to finish my degree. And if you do need to take student loans, it's fully understandable, but please do it in a degree that has jobs. Don't go into a field thinking that you're just going to go and figure it out. Go into a field that has work and that has been proven to get people work. It just doesn't make sense to be taking on student loan debt, spending a lot of time and money, and just not having a job at the end of it. Make sure that you do your research before you just choose a degree. Another thing that I found interesting for this video is if you spend your summer working, you can make about $12,000, and if you work throughout the year, you can make, close to $20,000 over the course of an entire year. So that, in theory, should be covering all of your expenses going to university in the average person's case, that $20,000 I told you about earlier. So why is it that there's so much student loan debt in the first place? If you can work in the summers, you can pull a part-time job while you're at school, why are people taking on so much student loan debt? It doesn't make any sense to me. And I think this is just purely where poor student decision-making comes in. When you're in university or college, you should be living like you're completely broke, because most of the time, at least for myself, I don't have an income. I didn't have any income when I was in school learning, so I would try and spend as little as possible every single month. I would maybe get a bottle of wine every month. My food expenses were about $250 a month. You're just trying to keep these expenses as low as you possibly can in order to give yourself the best shot in the future. I think another problem is that financial institutions are too willing to give student loans. I personally went and tried to get a student loan for myself from a financial institution, a student line of credit as they call it, and they were more than happy to give me $20,000 per year for the rest of my degree, which is a way, giving a student who doesn't really know what they're doing, $20,000 is like a freedom pass to blowing all of it. So personally, I think I'm lucky that I've been looking into finance and I find it super interesting. So for myself, I know that spending any of this money would just be completely insane and bonkers because I'm gonna have to pay it back at prime plus 1%. So why would you do that? Why would I do that to myself? It doesn't make any sense. Go get a job, go get money, go get your own money and use your own money to pay off your degree. If you have to, take a lighter course load. You can spread out your degree over 6 years and work part-time to pay it off. There are so many different ways to reduce the cost of school and to make it work for you that student loans just don't make any sense. And I think it's purely poor decision making, except for in the most extreme cases where you have to take on a student loan in order to have any shot. And in some cases, it's fully understandable, and I fully support people going out and doing that if they're going to get a job at the end of it. There's also something that's kind of seldom talked about, and those are scholarships. And I know that most of the time, once you're past second year or third year, you don't really think too much about what potential scholarships you could be getting. But there is still a lot out there for you, and going out into your community and trying to do some community work can often lead you into finding a scholarship because of your good work. So I think it's very valuable to be able to volunteer some of your time, which I personally need to work on, volunteering my own time. And just some final comments. I found another article that says 77% of students regret taking on their student loan debt. So if you want to be like 3/4 of people who have a student loan and took it out because they wanted to go out with their friends to the bar, or they couldn't withhold their own spending because CIBC or TD or RBC gave them a brand new shiny line of credit or a credit card that charges you 20 to 30% interest per year on your money. Absolutely insane. Don't even get me started on credit cards. It's a whole other video. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. I really hope that you learned something, and I hope that you found some of the information useful. Please share it with a friend or somebody who's thinking about taking on student loan debt, or even wants to learn a little bit more about how OSAP works, because I personally found it very confusing when I was first applying to OSAP. And I think that all of this information is very useful, and if you could please do me a favor and share it with somebody, that would be awesome. And I will see you all next time. Bye.